previous videos, we talked about the recommendations for developing rubrics. Normally, analytic rubrics are preferred as it is more thorough and looking into the performance of the students from various aspects. Now, whether it's supposed to be generic or task-specific rubrics, it is depending on the purpose of the assessment. As for the assessment criteria, the recommended number shall range between 3 to 6. Not too little in order to prevent bias, not too much. This is to avoid over-assessment. As for the scoring levels, a manageable range it would be 4 to 5 levels. You are recommended to start with 0. It is so that the students are not really meeting the requirements can be awarded with 0 marks. It was also mentioned for the performance criteria, the descriptions needs to be explicit and clear enough to demonstrate the differences of different levels of performance. Focus on the characteristics that can be observed by the assessor. And then when it comes to the rating, depending on the intervals of the rating scales, the smallest interval that you can go, it would be half of it. Now let us proceed with our discussions about the common mistakes while developing rubrics. We learn from the mistakes. The purpose here is not to penalize. Based on the examples given, we will try to avoid those mistakes. This is so that the rubrics can be effective and serve its purpose. Let us look at the first example here. This rubrics is meant for the presentation. There are a series of criteria identified, which include attire, slide organizations, content, creativity, time management, communications of informations and idea. The criteria set here is quite okay, as you don't see much overlapping between the criteria. The numbers of criteria fall between 3 to 6 criteria, which is just nice, manageable, and it covers a broad aspects as far as the presentations is concerned. However, personally, I do have some comment in terms of the criteria. First is about the attire. Normally, when I deal with the presentations, proper attires is a must, and this has been the cultures of my personal university. When it comes to the formal presentations in the class, all the students will have to wear formal, show their best look to make everything formal and professional. This has already been incorporated since year 1 and has been applied throughout the 4 years of engineering programs. This goes back to the fundamentals of the educations. We use the rubrics as a measure to facilitate learning. Now, when the attire has already been a common consent between the lecturers and the students, and it has been so many semesters, no issue with the attires. In that case, I feel it is not necessary to have it as the assessment criteria here. We can still regulate this from the operation side. Whoever are not wearing formal are not eligible for the presentations. Therefore, it is just something which is yes and no. Now, when the requirement here is only yes or no, it is quite difficult for you to differentiate for different performance levels. This is another issue. Now, how would you rate the attire? What makes a very good attire and what makes a good attire? On what basis you're going to rate that? Because of this, since it's already in the culture of the university students, you may remove the attire aspects here. As for the others, it should be okay, Probably I might not looking into the time management as well. Although time management is something that we can quantify, let's say now the times given to the students for the presentations is 15 minutes. So the allowance here, if the students exceeded 15 minutes, that means the students are not meeting the requirement. You may set different scale for defining the time management. Now you have to go back to the fundamentals of education. Is it necessary? Is it important? Is this essential in the working environment in future? Probably yes, but for engineering society, there are chances for formal presentations. Normally, time should be allocated to the students, and certain degree of flexibilities are normally given. In my personal opinion, I don't see this to be quite critical. Now, in terms of the rating later, how do you differentiate different levels of performance? Are you going to quantify like you put it exactly 15 minutes complete, then you get the full marks? 15 minutes plus minus 2 minutes, consider good. Plus minus 4 minutes, consider average, and so on so far. Which sometimes to me this one is not really appropriate. I don't see the significance and the purpose of having this as a criteria. Again, this can still be regulated if you really need this to be imposed to the students. Let's say now for the presentations, you may stop the students from continuing presenting after they have finished their time. If you are assessing their presentations, 15 minutes is actually good enough for you to determine the proficiency and the qualities of the presentation. It doesn't matter if you stop the students halfway, even though the students haven't finished their presentation. Since we can regulate this as a part of the presentations rules, probably you can consider to remove this as well. Then you shall focus on several significant criteria. Now the point here is, when you want to determine the criteria that you would like to assess, always go for something which is significant. And your rubric should be something that stimulates the learning of the students. If it is already in the culture, or if you can actually regulate it in some other ways, probably you don't have to put into the rubrics. This is my personal opinion. Next is about the performance criteria here. This is definitely not a way to produce the performance criteria. Let's say now you're talking about the slide organization. How do you define very good? How do you define good? And what makes the difference between organized and good? Even though you have terminology to reflect different levels, it makes no difference when you have this and without it. By looking at the scale here, we know the lowest mark it will be the poorest, the highest mark is going to be the highest. Now if your performance criteria is this, you will have problem with the consistency in terms of the rating outcome. This rubric definitely cannot be used. Now how should you deal with the rubrics? You will need explicit statements to clearly define what makes a good performance and what makes a poor performance. And within the definition here, it shouldn't be only one dimension. It should more clearly reflect what is the content of that particular criteria, based on certain indicators indicating that the levels of performance of the criteria. So when you construct the rubrics, if possible, you construct this first before you translate them into full sentences. These are my recommendations. Now let us look at another example. This is also about the presentation. We have 6 criteria here. It is about the communications, explanations, slides, Q&A, question and answer section, time management, attire or appearance. This one looks slightly better than this. Obviously, this cannot be used. And as for this, there are rooms for improvements. We mentioned about removing the attire as the criteria. We also mentioned about removing the time management as the criteria as well. However, there is no harm for us to dig deeper on this. Based on the descriptions here, the highest score will be defined by finish on time. This one is 2 minutes deviations from the time allocated, 5 minutes deviations from the time allocated. Now, based on the definition here, if the students completed the presentation earlier, it's also considered not meeting the requirement, and this defeats the purpose of time management. When we have issue with time to do the presentations, normally we don't like the time to be overshooted. But if we can effectively deliver the message or informations shorter time than what is given to us, this is supposedly better. The student should not be penalized on that. Of course, this issue can be arguable. You may say that if the students completed the presentation earlier, it could be student compromise in certain informations to be delivered. Now, if the students missing certain significant informations, you will need to make sure that some other criteria should be able to cover those. Students may finish on time and get a really high marks for that, but the students compromise certain significant informations to be presented. This might affect the explanations. Because of this, there should be low score for this criteria, but high score for the time management. Another issue with this, it will be 10 minutes and 15 minutes overshooting or deviated from the time allocated. Let's say now the durations of presentation is only 15 minutes and the deviations now you set it to be 15 minutes. Definitely it's not going to be less. 15 minutes less means that students are not doing the presentation. This is not possible. When it comes to the assessment using these rubrics, definitely the students are doing the presentation. How about the students overshoot by another 15 minutes? I thought you have the patience to quantify that 15 minutes once you realize that the students have overshoot the time. In order for you to rate 0 for the time management here, you really need to time the presentation. You need to make sure the students present more than half an hour, since the time allocated is 15 minutes, plus another 15 minutes, half an hour, then you can assign student 0. Do you have sufficient patience to wait for that? Just for this criteria? I really doubt that. So either way, I see this is not feasible. And back to my original point, I don't see the time management to be quite significant. That qualifies it as a criteria to be incorporated in the rubrics in order to facilitate the learning of the students. Might as well I put more concentrations and emphasis onto the effectiveness of the delivery. There are much more things that students can learn instead of the time management. How about their gesture? How about their pace? And so on and so forth. This has not been effectively graded by this rubric here. Same goes to attributes. How do you differentiate very formal and formal? No proper attire probably is easy to identify, but normally this will not happen. Casual smart or casual attire, probably. but you can actually regulate it as a part of the rules for the presentation. In this case, it is just a simple task to the students, either wearing the formal or casual. So when the conditions is yes or no, probably you don't have to make it so complex in the rubrics here. Now let us look at the communication part. Looking at the descriptions for the performance criteria. First, there are some terminology which can be ambiguous. What does it mean by a little bit less confidence? What is the difference between lacking confidence and a little bit less confidence? Where is the clear cut between those? This is about the unclear descriptions to differentiate the performance levels. Another thing is in this performance criteria statements here. Speak well but sometimes unclear. What does it mean by sometime? And when you put this as the performance criteria level 3, which is the second best out of all the performance criteria, normally we would like to express it in the manner of positive instead of negative. Speak well is positive, but sometimes unclear is negative. Since it is more towards the positive outcome, if possible, we make the description here to be rather positive, such as speak well and clear message most of the time. If you want to make it more explicit, probably provide a range of the duration, such as 60 to 80% of the time. It is so that it is more reflective to the positive terminologies. For my personal practice, since that we are using 5 scale here, the middle one, normally I will express it in the mode of neutral. Anything below the middle, it will be more towards the negative expression. As for the performance criteria higher than the middle one, normally I will make it more positive. Why do we need to do that? It is so that we are able to identify the scales based on what is implied in the performance criteria statements, even without referring to the numbers here. Sometimes your assessment rubrics may be too large, that it comes to the second page of the paper, where the scale for the performance level might not be shown side by side. At least by looking into the statement there, we will know different levels of performance. Another comment about this rubric is that when you come to the criteria here, this is about the communication. However, the performance criteria statements here is about how clear can the student speak and how confident the students can speak. It is more towards speaking. In my personal opinion, the performance criteria statements here does not fully reflect the relevant criteria. It is a bit biased, which only constitute part of the communications if you want to be rigorous. Similar thing happens to the other criteria. When you only look into the criteria in one dimension, there could be certain degree of bias. In order to minimize the bias, you will need to first look into the components constituting the relevant criteria. Break down them into several components and then construct them at different levels before you consolidate all this into the performance criteria statements.